Pam, Dixon, and Teki, FALCONER. Hello.
Bon après-midi, Joseph, et merci beaucoup.
I'm happy to have both of you here. You've been patient, you went through and listened to the limitations of the technology, and you've heard some positive applications of the technology, and you also heard about what our audience believes about the threat of face recognition and what we should be doing about it. So let me start this session by asking Pam the following question, and then I'll funnel a variant of it to Teki. There's not a single day that passes without me opening up the newspapers or online and seeing a headline about face recognition. It continues to be attracting a lot of headlines, mostly positive, mostly negative around the world. Some localities are even, and countries are trying to ban it or restrict it. Why do you think this is happening, in your opinion? Do you think we have, we're not arriving at an informed dialogue, or do you think there is a real threat here and something needs to be done about it?
I think both are true. I do believe that the science is now in regards to face technologies, and we now know that there is significant risk of both age, gender, and racial utilizations that are biased and unfair. So this is a problem that needs to be grappled with, and it has not yet been grappled with. This is particularly true in the law enforcement context. And I think that is the other reason that you see people being very concerned and quite vocal, is that a lot of the uses that are the most objectionable carry the most risk, which is law enforcement use that is not by consent and it is mandatory. So when people feel like they don't have choices and they don't have autonomy, they tend to have very emotional responses, which gets to your question about, you know, is this hype, etc. I don't think it's hype. I just think that it's a very emotional response, the move to bans and whatnot. And governments are going to have to listen a lot more. And I think there's going to have to be a center found. I don't think the dialogue is completely informed yet. But at the same time, I also think there are a lot of risks that are not being addressed.
Hold on to that thought. Let me go to Teki and let's get the view from the continent. I mean, Teki, what about Africa? Do you think face recognition is making negative headlines there? And what is the nature of the concerns that people have in Africa that go beyond what, let's say, Pam has said for the rest of the world?
Definitely on top of the list for Africa is racial bias. And we're very much aware of the findings. And as Patrick highlighted, you would see some demographic changes. And we know the impact that has had on people of African descent. And that is really a high risk there. Another major concern has also been around the political landscape of Africa being a maturing democracy and the ability to actually have governments overset themselves and more or less limit some other rights like the right to freedom of expression and other issues. So there's also been a lot of concerns because we currently see deployment in the security sector as well, where national security agencies are deploying facial recognition technologies. And there's always a concern of some form of covert surveillance as well, which is a big issue. The third one has to do with the whole issue around data sovereignty. Most of these technologies are not being developed by organizations or companies that are African oriented or country specific. They are being developed by developed countries, and most of these companies are there and are subject to laws in developed countries. And so there's also that concern around whether this is another form of neocolonialism whereby information is being collected on Africans to train these AI systems, but at the end of the day, it could be used, to undermine our political systems or the independence of these countries. So these are a number of issues that are coming up. And of course, the privacy angle of it, the transparency issues around what is being deployed, how it's being used, and who has access to it. All these come into play when we're talking about facial technologies in Africa.
It's quite actually a rich and complex set of concerns when you add sovereignty, when you add the potential for the public feeling that this is a new version of colonialism, etc., without them understanding potentially the benefits. I'd like to pose you both for a second and ask somebody from the community, anybody that wants to join the panel from the community voices, to join specifically about this issue, which is we're still talking about, which is why should there be concerns about face recognition in Africa or in the world in general? So anybody that wants to join the panel, operator, please elevate them as a panelist. You have to turn on your video because we have here total transparency. You can't speak without your face being shown. No pun intended. Anybody, I see somebody raise their hand, they want to join the panel to talk about why we should be concerned about face recognition and why the headlines perhaps are justified in painting this concern. Operator, could you please elevate the individual to community voice? Apology, they're having problems bringing that person up.
Hello, I'm here, thank you.
Okay, please introduce yourself. I've never met you before, but I'm pleased to see you with us.
I've met you before, Joseph Atick. This is Paul Macharia. I'm based in Kenya.
Oh, Kenya. Sorry. I'm sorry. It's been a long day. So hi, Paul.
It's okay. Hi, how are you? I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I think in my experience working with biometrics, especially in the healthcare setting, I think the concern is fear of the unknown. Maybe there are many unknowns in this emerging technology, but in my other thinking also, it's what now COVID-19 and other circumstances are making us work with, because now contact-based biometrics seem to be not very acceptable, for lack of a better word, when we use biometrics for identification in like the healthcare setting. Infection control is a big concern. Thanks.
Now, so in fact, Paul, you're advocating something positive. You're basically saying, in fact, we need face in the health arena because of these restrictions on contacting surfaces. If I understood that's your comment, that yes, there are concerns, but in fact, we shouldn't forget that there are certain legitimate needs, such as the use of face in health in order to avoid contamination and contacting surfaces. Do I understand you correctly, Paul?
That's what I mean, Dr. Atick, that we need face recognition in a healthcare setting because of the biggest concern, infection control.
Okay, so now, Teki, going back to you, we see that obviously the concerns that you've raised are legitimate concerns, but when I talk to a doctor who is actually in the field dealing with infections and disease, he would be saying that, yes, I understand, but my priority is dealing with managing the identity of sick patients, and therefore I could afford to take the risks that you mentioned. And do you think this is a short-term vision, or there are certain justifications for using face because of the world that we're in right now and the fact that we need to be in a contactless environment?
Joseph, clearly there is a good reason to use face, and of course, having started on the basis of the risks does not mean that we cannot use face. But the challenge is that there is really no transparency around when we should use face and when we should not. Clearly, we should attribute the risks associated, which has been identified and raised by Patrick, and that should inform the context under which we're going to use face, for instance. Yes, if there is a health risk and there is the need to use face, it is acceptable, but we must put it within a context that continues to protect the individual in place and minimizes risk to other areas. So the fact that, using facial technology will enable a doctor do or perform their services better, or enable us protect the larger society. If you're looking at COVID, and in this case, let's say that somebody has COVID and they're supposed to stay at a particular place to minimize the infection, then you look at the greater good. But the challenge has always been for the continent around the lack of, call it a framework that really provides this form of guidance, and the likelihood that now some businesses are thinking about deployment of biometric technologies, including facial technologies. For instance, we have some banks that are using it. Under what context are they planning to deploy it? Is this sufficient reason? Is that a good reason, or could there be other methods that will minimize the risk associated with the use of facial technologies? So I'm not necessarily against the use of these technologies, but I believe that the context should define when we should use them.
Okay, that's great. So Pam, we're now getting into the nuances. What we're basically saying that, the technology is not good or bad. It's the use cases that could be bad and that we should protect society from them, if I understand where we're heading. What is the process for a community or for a country? And obviously cultural influences could be different, one continent, one country to another. How do you go about establishing what are acceptable uses of face recognition? And do we have any sort of experiences from the past for something similar that we can rely on, any models that we can rely on?
Yes, I think there are a lot of models that could be used. Right now, they're not being used though. So that is one of the reasons we're seeing so much chaos in terms of policy. So I think one of the important things we have to mention are bans and moratoriums. Also best practices. We see a lot of best practices written. We also see an increasing number of bans in certain jurisdictions. But there's a big, giant middle section which has really been left alone, and that is where all the richness and personalization, if you will, is done. And this comes in the form of the model of safety regulations. So if you think about dangerous chemicals, one can think of lead, for example. Lead is actually not a banned substance. In Africa, there are very stringent rules in regards to lead, and paint must have only a 90%, it must be 90% lead free. These are rules in most African countries. And very similarly, face recognition can have rules that include risk minimization, risk assessments, certifications, required documentations. After it's been put on the market, there would be ongoing surveillance or observation by regulatory authorities, such as data protection authorities and others. And in this way, you can start to build a very robust framework of protections when all the stakeholders agree that face recognition is appropriate to use. But not all use cases are going to be appropriate. And that is, I think, what Teki's really talking about. the community and those unique situations need to be decided by the stakeholders that are there. And it is when governments and businesses and others make, just autocratic decisions that creates real tensions in the use of any technology, but especially face recognition. So the trust has to be earned here.
Yes, I understand. But who does that role? I mean, when we look at harmful material, I mean, we've got bodies like the Food and Drug Administration, which basically does not allow any consumable to go on the market without them classifying it or categorizing it. In any given country, if we think about face recognition in that context, who do you think is the right body to pronounce that this is harmful in this application and will not be allowed in our country, or this is acceptable? What body is that? It's not just data protection.
No, it's not just data protection. I think there are going to have to be multi-stakeholder groups that come together within governments to make these determinations. But I would say that data protection authorities must be present. And in countries where there are not yet data protection authorities, then someone with that kind of expertise needs to be present. And the role of civil society is very important here. Civil society needs to provide feedback and expertise, as do all of the stakeholders. But it really needs to be a very respectful and productive conversation. I think one of the problems that exists right now is this very adversarial lack of communication. And I think it's just adding to the problem rather than solving the problem.
Yeah, okay. So pause here for a second. I want to elevate somebody from the community to join the conversation on this specific topic. I understand there is a candidate that raised their hand. Please, operator, elevate this candidate. And we're continuing essentially to talk about how we can establish if certain applications, certain use cases of face recognition are legitimate for the community. It seems that there is a vacuum right now in many countries. There is no body that's already established, so we have to do it on an ad hoc basis. Stakeholders, civil society, government regulators. Yes, please, introduce yourself, unmute your microphone. Who do we have with us?
Hello.
Yes.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, please.
Hello. Hi, my name is Chastity Wright. I am the founder and CTO of Infiltron Software Suite. And we have our social responsibility aspect of our functionality is to mitigate issues around race and gender equality. And we're currently doing some development around being able to accurately detect transgender people as well. But to speak to what we're talking about right now, I'm actually getting ready to do a presentation for AI Expo Africa tomorrow on this very subject of being able to provide cybersecurity and equality in biometric technology. So one of the things that I did, because I like to hold myself accountable, not only as a technologist, but as a business owner and as a Black person in this space, I created some international trademarks that speak to the government and legislative aspects of what should happen around biometric technology. So essentially, if anyone develops biometric technologies, whether it's facial recognition, if it does not have functionalities that mitigate race and gender equality built into them, they should not be used. It's just that simple. It's just that direct. But there should be an auditing body or some type of accreditation body per government around the world that does this.
So it's basically this concept.
And if you guys want me to share my screen, I can't do that. Yeah.
No. Okay, it's okay. This is not the
correct.
Got an important
but
message. This is the do no harm of the application, essentially. What you're talking about, we cannot allow an application in society which harms a certain group of society in the society.
Correct,
okay.
Joseph. Absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you.
And it starts with the development teams as well. It starts with the development teams. The development teams themselves need to be diverse so they can in turn show diversity in the development, the software that's being developed itself.
Right. One last question to you. Where do you come to us from? Which country?
I am in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States.
Welcome, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me on, guys.
Thank you. Okay, we want to continue this discussion. We thank our guest. I'll continue the discussion with Pam and Teki. Now, so go back to the second, and I want to look at the numbers in front of me so I don't cite it. We asked the question, what was, in your opinion, is the best way to deal with the menace, potential menace of face recognition? In the first question, 60% of people felt that there was an elevated menace, more than other biometrics. And so we asked what was the best way to deal with that menace. And 60% believe that there has to be laws specific to face recognition. 38% said no, data protection laws are enough. And then only 2% believed in industry self-regulation. I will relate to you the results that I had done. I had done this survey in London about 5 years ago. And I can tell you that industry self-regulation at that time was at 22%. 22% believed that industry self-regulation was enough. Today, we are essentially seeing that nobody is advocating for industry self-regulation. So we move that out of the equation. So we focus on whether it is laws specific to face or whether it is just data protection. So let me start with Teki this time and get your perspective. Do you really agree that we should be working with legislators to make sure there is an informed face policy, or should we be putting our energy to inform their data protection laws?
I believe it's actually both. I wish the survey had given me the option to prioritize. In fact, from where I sit, I think it's all three: industry regulation, some form of regulation attributed to technology, and then data protection. The reason I'm saying this is because data protection, of course, has the overall, but then it has a very specific role, which is looking at the individual, the personal data and use of it, and transparency around it, accuracy, and the rest. But as I mentioned, when you look at the African context, there are other bigger issues around data sovereignty. There are other issues around manipulation to limit other fundamental rights. And so you would actually see that you probably may need, and I agree with Pam, you may need a broader scope of stakeholders to address each of these issues that continue to be a concern. Legislation is a good start, but I honestly do not believe that it is sufficient. And especially looking at the context in Africa, if, for instance, where are all these technological companies? Ownership of these technologies, where are they based? They are not based in Africa. They're not based in Ghana or any of our 55 countries. Most of them are not based there. So even if you look at a regulatory intervention by way of law, you have to enforce these laws against these companies. And you may not have the necessary structures and tools to be able to go after these, especially the big tech giants. So for Africa, we really need to sit down and look beyond them and look at where the real issues are and create some form of system or framework that brings to play the laws and the regulations which will enable some form of regulators, but rather build a larger ecosystem that recognizes certain values as far as these technologies are concerned and are willing to apply these values for the greater good of everyone.
Teki, wonderful overview of what you think should be happening. Pam, instead of repeating that, could you give us an overview of what is actually happening in some countries around the world. How are they dealing with this situation? Are there models that Africa could use to guide what the next steps should be, perhaps along the lines of what Teki is mentioned?
Yes, I think that it's very important to understand that most countries are moving ahead with uses of face recognition in law enforcement and national security context, period, end of discussion. This is without discussion typically with citizenry and without discussion of specific use cases. And this is leading to increasing tensions. But I, again, am going to point to a certain powerlessness that people feel when this happens. And I do think this is of concern. The second thing I would say is that because of the impact of COVID-19, we're also seeing a lot of movement toward the use of face systems so that there's no touching involved. But I urge caution here because we need to ensure that all of the use cases have been run through and discussed amongst all stakeholders, including citizens, those who are not citizens, but within the country, government officials and so forth. But the thing is that what we also are seeing is a real breakdown. Teki mentioned something very important, which is the idea of, something very practical that governments, stakeholders, companies, et cetera, can implement on the ground. So I myself do not prefer self-regulation. It's very failure prone, but I do like the idea of regulator approved codes of conduct that have oversight to them so that everyone who's supposed to be subject to the code behaves. We're seeing some of this in Africa coming from Morocco and also Mauritius. And I believe, and Teki, please let me know, I know there are other African countries that are also looking at doing regulator approved codes of conduct. This is a really important area of development that I think is right for Africa.
I mean, Teki, what is the United States doing in this area? You're based in the United States. What are they doing? We hear a lot of local and state creating contradictory things and bills that are competing. What's happening? Very quickly.
You mean me?
Yeah, yes, the question to you. I mean, the United States.
The US is an absolute mess right now because we're seeing a policy structure that focuses on bans that are very limited actually in scope and also best practices. So the actual middle ground where you really need controls such as certification audits, as the guest was mentioning, and all of those really robust safety mechanisms and controls, those are not being discussed. So we're avoiding, in the United States, we're avoiding looking at the whole life cycle of facial recognition. We're avoiding looking at the whole ecosystem of face recognition systems. This is a huge gap, a huge problem, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about what is and what is not a problem. And I must say the tone is deeply adversarial, and that's a problem. We need to be able to talk to each other and find a center.
Pause. I want to elevate somebody to the panel that I think will be a firework as well. Operator, please elevate Maxime. Pam, maybe you can briefly, while we're elevating Maxime, tell us what's happening in Europe.
Europe is very interesting. We had France regulators say, hey, look, the schools in the south of France, you are not going to be able to install face recognition for children. You also see the Information Commissioner's Office at the UK making an announcement that they are going to be looking, and it's a very brave announcement, they're going to be looking at regulating and controlling law enforcement uses, certain law enforcement uses of facial recognition technology. So I think in Europe, and also the European Commission has announced that they are going to be regulating face recognition technologies EU-wide. That's to come this year, hopefully, but Europe is making advances.
Okay. Okay, I understand. Thank you. Maxime, welcome.
Hi, Joseph. How are you? Nice to see you.
Very well. Thank you.
I feel like we've been having this conversation for 20 years, but it's finally now risen to the top of everyone's minds. And I think it's fabulous because I think it's really important. And I just wanted to make a few comments and maybe the panelists can respond. One, I think the idea of banning technology is like banning books. You just can't do it, right? The cat is out of the bag. facial recognition is here. And I think the knee-jerk reaction, particularly in some areas of the United States, to say, oh, we're going to ban this technology is kind of silly and ineffective. And I think the notion of self-regulation, which is something that I've advocated for 20 years, is just not happening. I mean, I think that the industry has had lots of time to build in safeguards, as one of the earlier guests mentioned, into the technology itself, something that, again, I've advocated for a long time, and it's not happening. So I think what we need are really public-private partnerships to create standards. It'd be both on a global level for interoperability, and then within individual sovereign areas that speaks to the particular concerns that any of those areas have.
Okay. Any reaction from the panel to what Maxime said? Thank you, Maxime.
Just from a US perspective, what I would say about bans is that if you look at other regulatory models, such as drug safety regulations or medical device regulations, there is a very robust procedure for proposing a ban and then creating a ban. Those procedures have not largely been followed in the United States. So some of the bans are really kind of very political, is what I would say. But that doesn't mean that there should never be a ban. I do think that there are certain use cases in face recognition systems that need to be considered for bans, particularly when the cameras are very low quality, such as, for example, face recognition on body cams used live. And I think we have to be very careful to not throw the baby out with the bathwater on either side.
Okay, thank you. Maxime, thank you very much. I want to elevate
Thanks,
Paul.
Joseph.
Thank you. Paul, operator, could you elevate Paul from the community voices? And then we'll come back to the panel with the closing remarks. Do we have Paul? Paul, please.
Hello,
Yes.
can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Paul. Please introduce yourself. Welcome to ID for Africa.
Okay, my name is Paul Damali, originally based in Ghana, co-founder and CEO of Approve. Approve basically is eKYC infrastructure across African countries. We train algorithms specifically to analyze, ID documents of Africans, and we are across about 6 African countries currently.
Excellent. And so this is an African company that is specialized and focused in KYC. Do you access face data? Do you use face as an element in the KYC process?
Yes, we do access these databases. Typically, what has to happen first is us understanding the regulatory regime in each country. So for example, there are about 16 data protection laws all across Africa. And as it stands now, we are in about 6 of these countries. And that's Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt. You need to sort of like really be locally informed and understand the local context and what the data protection and other adjoining regulations say about how to access these kind of biometric data, what to use them for, but most importantly, also thinking about how you enable consent-based systems.
Yes.
One thing I want to point out, we've been using technologies in the industry not properly. So what we do at Approve, we call it facial comparison because it is enabled by consent by the customer.
Individual.
Recognition, however, means that, and which is typically what the security agents do, because they already have access to the database and they don't enable the customer consent. If a security camera sort of like picks your face, they don't need your permission to use you. So there's a difference between those two, and we need to be able to recognize it. And so when it comes to application in industry like financial services, health, more of what is done is the consent or face comparison, which is consent-based.
Yes, so what Paul is saying, that in thinking about how to protect against the misuse of face, we should distinguish between face authentication and face recognition. Those two animals might require different types of legislation or different types of handling. Thank you, Paul, for being with us. Thanks for joining the ID for Africa family. I'm going to ask panelists to close on the thought. Pam, to you, and then Teki. Where do we go from here? I mean, obviously, we've just only begun. We've only opened the subject. I mean, we could go on to the whole evening discussing the subject. What should be the next steps for the international community? And then Teki, what should be the next steps for the African community?
The next steps for the international community is to have a non-adversarial discussion between all the stakeholders that are in this debate, and to determine all of the regulatory tools that we need to be addressing this. We have to use more regulatory tools. We're not using all of them. We're not using certifications. We're not using codes of conduct, etc. So we've got to add those in. We've got to learn how to talk to each other. We've got to learn that we're going to have to work together to set appropriate limits in context. And this is a joint operation. It can't be done unilaterally by any stakeholder.
Okay, thanks, Pam. So dialogue, not an adversarial. There's no for or against. We gotta get together and we gotta develop the new types of tools that actually allow us to assess, if I understand.
Yes. These tools are well understood, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we do need to get on the road. We do need to take steps forward. We cannot just let the situation stay as it is, because
Right.
it is not productive.
Okay, so Teki, please guide us through this.
Yes, for Africa, I think that we have to be more transparent, especially at the governmental level, around how we are adopting and using these technologies. And I believe that for industry and vendors, they also need to come around the table and build this transparency into this whole area. And I would echo what Pam also said about bringing all the stakeholders to a dialogue. Clearly, because of some of the key issues involved, I would call on all the regulatory agencies regulating IT and technologies generally, regulators looking at data protection, and other human rights regulators and CSOs to sit around the table to really come out with some level of guidance on what is appropriate, what should be acceptable, and what should not.
Teki, is Africa Digital Rights Hub doing any of that right now?
We're currently conducting a number of research around facial technologies and how they are being deployed. Based on what we find out, we will probably propose, like we did with the ID, some code of conduct on what should go in and what should be taken out, like we did with the ID systems for Africa.
Okay. Well, as I said, this is not the end, this is the beginning. I think we will be bringing in the subject again throughout the year to see how we're progressing in our thinking. We need actionable steps. We're identifying problems, but we're not identifying the steps to how we should solve them.